Pro-abortion women are calling for a sex strike to protect their right to have the abortion they won't need if they go on a sex strike. The women are protesting the selection of a Supreme Court justice that hasn't actually happened yet, and the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, which the justice who hasn't been appointed hasn't made. Roe v. Wade, you'll remember, is the famous 1973 decision in which 7 justices said, quote, "The right to kill your children is protected by the penumbra of the emanations of the..." Oh, forget it. We just want you to kill children, so go to it, unquote. The justices went on to say that the Constitution only allowed you to kill your children while they were in the womb, since once they come out of the womb, they might be able to alert the police. Now, with President Trump picking a new justice, leftists and other loons are afraid this decision will be overturned and replaced with something actually constitutional. So, today, as a service to pro-abortion women, I'd like to offer the Andrew Klavan Show's solution to these leftist fears. From now on, women who support Roe v. Wade should absolutely refuse to have sex with any man who hasn't stood up in public and pledged before an actual religious figure to love and honor that pro-abortion woman for the rest of her life. These pro-abortion women should further insist that before any man can have sex with them, he must allow her to use his last name as a sign that they are united for life, and he should even agree to help raise and support any child that arises from their sexual union. This brilliant protest strategy will render any Supreme Court decisions on Roe v. Wade absolutely irrelevant, since from now on, whatever child these pro-abortion women conceive will be well taken care of and therefore likely to actually increase the joy and meaning of their lives. I don't know why no one's thought of this before. Don't say I never did anything for you, pro-abortion women. You're welcome. Trigger warning, I'm Andrew Klavan, and this is The Andrew Klavan Show.
According to research, in order for a culture to maintain itself for more than 25 years, there must be a fertility rate of 2.11 children per family. With anything less, the culture will decline. Historically, no culture has ever reversed a 1.9 fertility rate. A rate of 1.3, impossible to reverse, because it would take 80 to 100 years to correct itself. And there is no economic model that can sustain a culture during that time. In other words, if 2 sets of parents each have 1 child, there are half as many children as parents. If those children have 1 child, then there are 1/4 as many grandchildren as grandparents. If only 1 million babies are born in 2006, it's hard to have 2 million adults enter the workforce in 2026. As the population shrinks, so does the culture. As of 2007, the fertility rate in France was 1.8, England 1.6, Greece 1.3, Germany 1.3, Italy 1.2, Spain 1.1. Across the entire European Union of 31 countries, the fertility is a mere 1.38. Historical research tells us these numbers are impossible to reverse. In a matter of years, Europe as we know it will cease to exist. Yet the population of Europe is not declining. Why? Immigration. Islamic immigration. Of all population growth in Europe since 1990, 90% has been Islamic immigration. France, 1.8 children per family. Muslims, 8.1. In southern France, traditionally one of the most populated church regions in the world, there are now more mosques than churches. 30% of children ages 20 and younger are Islamic. In the larger cities such as Nice, Marseille, and Paris, that number has grown to 45%. By 2027, 1 in 5 Frenchmen will be Muslim. In just 39 years, France will be an Islamic republic. In the last 30 years, the Muslim population of Great Britain rose from 82,000 to 2.5 million, a 30-fold increase. There are over 1,000 mosques, many of them former churches. In the Netherlands, 50% of all newborns are Muslim, and in only 15 years, half of the population of the Netherlands will be Muslim. In Russia, there are over 23 million Muslims. That's 1 out of 5 Russians. 40% of the entire Russian army will be Islamic in just a few short years. Currently in Belgium, 25% of the population and 50% of all newborns are Muslim. The government of Belgium has stated 1/3 of all European children will be born to Muslim families by 2025, just 17 years away. The German government, the first to talk about this publicly, recently released a statement saying, "The fall in the German population can no longer be stopped. Its downward spiral is no longer reversible. It will be a Muslim state by the year 2050. Muammar al-Gaddafi of Libya said, "There are signs that Allah will grant victory to Islam in Europe, without swords, without guns, without conquest. We don't need terrorists. We don't need homicide bombers. The 50+ million Muslims in Europe will turn it into a Muslim continent within a few decades." There are currently 52 million Muslims in Europe. The German government said that number is expected to double in the next 20 years to 104 million. Closer to home, the numbers tell a similar story. Right now, Canada's fertility rate is 1.6, nearly a full point below what is required to sustain a culture. And Islam is now the fastest growing religion. Between 2001 and 2006, Canada's population increased by 1.6 million, 1.2 of those immigration. In the United States, the current fertility rate of American citizens is 1.6. With the influx of the Latino nations, the rate increases to 2.11, the bare minimum required to sustain a culture. In 1970, there were 100,000 Muslims in America. Today, there are over 9 million. The world is changing. It's time to wake up. 3 years ago, a meeting of 24 Islamic organizations was held in Chicago. The transcripts of that meeting showed in detail their plans to evangelize America through journalism, politics, education, and more. They said, "We must prepare ourselves for the reality that in 30 years, there will be 50 million Muslims living in America. The world that we live in is not the world in which our children and grandchildren will live."
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Hope you had a great 4th of July. While you were celebrating the birth of our country, some on the left were bemoaning its very existence. Vox.com commemorated Independence Day with a piece entitled, "3 Reasons the American Revolution Was a Mistake." Progressives despise Donald Trump so much they've begun to dislike the country that elected him. Hate has clouded their vision and distorted their values completely. For generations, for example, liberals championed free speech and privacy and due process. Now they lead the charge against civil liberties and all who dare to defend them. Alan Dershowitz has been a liberal icon for 50 years, a stalwart defender of civil liberties. Just this morning, he was denounced by the left as an agent of the Kremlin, of Vladimir Putin himself. His crime? Suggesting that the president might also be protected by the Bill of Rights, just like everybody else. Not allowed. Professor Dershowitz joins us in just a minute to explain what happened to him. Meanwhile, signs of growing extremism in this country on the left are everywhere. Just yesterday, a Congolese immigrant shut down the Statue of Liberty, our Statue of Liberty, to protest the Trump administration's immigration policies. The left applauded that. But take 3 steps back and think about what you're watching right here. Congo is a war-ravaged hellscape, a country noted for mass rape and cannibalism. Imagine escaping a country like that and being welcomed in our country, the United States. You'd be grateful, wouldn't you? Many Congolese are grateful. This person is not grateful at all. She took over one of our monuments to scream about how racist we are, and progressives support her. They have gone insane. On MSNBC, New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg explained that 81-year-old Justice Anthony Kennedy somehow betrayed America by daring to retire from the Supreme Court. Watch this.
This is Kennedy betraying the country. The Democrats could have done very little.
He's 81 years old and served 30 years. He's not betraying the country. We should thank him for his service.
To not
Why
let
do you have
Trump,
to demean people in that making your point?
Because they
you
are
have a valid point to
destroying
make.
this
You
country.
don't need.
Retiring at 81 is betrayal because it's inconvenient to their political plans. And then there's this, yet more casual racism from MSNBC. Notice how it's just assumed that there's something distasteful or even immoral about hiring someone of a specific race and gender. The left used to believe in judging people on the content of their character, not on the color of their skin. That seems like ancient history now. Watch.
For the president, it's going to be all about the personal connection, who he feels comfortable with in the moment.
So you're saying he's going to pick the man, the white man. 90% of Donald Trump's elections for U.S. attorneys and federal judges were white men.
What happened to liberals? Well, a lot of things. One, they lost power, and that drove them off the deep end. They plan to get their power back, no matter what it takes. A new book by Professor David Ferris is called It's Time to Fight Dirty, and it explains how the left plans to do it. Here's the summary of the book from Politico. Quote, grant statehood to D.C. and Puerto Rico and break California into 7 with the goal of adding 16 new Democrats to the Senate. Expand the Supreme Court and the federal courts, packing them with liberal judges. Move to multi-member House districts to roll back the effects of partisan gerrymandering. Pass a new Voting Rights Act, including nationwide automatic voter registration, felon enfranchisement, and an end to voter ID laws. Grant citizenship to millions of undocumented immigrants, creating a host of new Democratic-leaning voters. As Ferris puts it in the book, quote, Republicans have always feared that immigration would change the character of American society. Democrats should reward them with their very worst nightmare. Remember that paragraph. It is the blueprint for what we're about to see. They're going to tell you it's about civil rights or some other principle they pretend to care about, but they're lying. It's about seizing power and holding it. That's their only aim. They're deadly serious about it. While you were grilling in the backyard last night, they were plotting, in effect, a coup.
Anecdotally, that an increasing number of people were plowing into my vineyard, and every time I would call the Highway Patrol, he would say they had the 3 no's: no registration, no license, and no insurance. And I noticed the school that I had gone to school 30 years earlier, 40 years, which had been primarily Hispanic, was now exclusively so. And other towns that I travel on the way to Stanford University from my farm had become de facto apartheid communities. Towns such as Mendota or San Joaquin, where Spanish was spoken exclusively, signs were in Spanish. And it seemed to me a very illiberal thing was happening in a country that was devoted to integration, assimilation, and intermarriage. And yet when you looked at the data, and I tried to do that in the late 90s, early 2000, you noticed a number of odd things, artifacts, that this number 10 to 11 million illegal aliens was almost static. We had no numbers. We had no means to certify that criteria of how many were here illegally, but people just picked an arbitrary number. And indeed, today, that's 8 years later, it's still that number. In fact, I think most of us suspect there's far more than 10 million. Another thing that I noticed very quickly was that proponents of what I would call open borders always want the prime directive for all of them is to confuse the issue of illegal and legal immigration. Everybody in this room is for legal measured immigration. Indeed, we are more generous to Mexico than any other country. I think the figure is somewhere around 160,000 immigrants and green card holders. And yet that has to be blurred, those lines between illegal and legal. And finally, the very nomenclature, as a philologist who always tries to pay attention to language, I noticed that you could not use the word illegal alien in the late 90s. It was called undocumented worker, even though many people were not working. Indeed, a quarter of people in California assistance are here illegally from Mexico. 15,000 people in the California penal system are here illegally from Mexico. And so they're not all working. And it wasn't a problem of having documents. People didn't just forget them at the border, they never had them. So undocumented worker was a very imprecise term. Those were the symptoms that we all noticed, and then to diagnose this problem, we use a Latin phrase, cui bono, to whom did it benefit? Because obviously it showed a disrespect for the law. It was very illiberal to welcome people in from Jalisco or Oaxaca, use their material, their body capital, so to speak. There's no finer workers in the world than to have a roofer or a farm labor 18, 19 unattached male. But yet as people age and in those types of occupations, whether it's on your knees 18, 16 hours a day laying concrete or picking peaches with 50 pounds on your stomach, a person's not designed to do that for 20 or 30 years. And so we noticed that in all these small towns, people in their 40s and 50s and 60s were not working as they had, and yet they were being replaced by younger workers, and the employer was de facto throwing them out on the entitlement industry to pick up the cost when their bodies literally, in some cases, gave out. And without education and without English and without legality, it was very hard for those people to see cement work or shingling as an entry-level job that would lead to a foremanship. So it was obviously in the interest of the employer. Now, the argument was that there's a shortage of workers, but I was struck that often in places where illegal immigration was highest, the unemployment rate of people was also high. In California in the late 1990s, Central Valley had 11% unemployment rate, and yet the California Farm Bureau said in the case of Fresno County, if it did not have 30,000 workers from Oaxaca in any particular summer, it would not harvest, fill in the blanks, peaches, raisins, grapes. So there was something going on besides just a shortage of workers. We had the manpower, but psychologically or spiritually or morally, we were not able to inculcate to our own youth, and indeed second generation children of citizens who were children of illegal aliens, that it was an ennobling experience to go out and do physical labor. Another group, obviously, besides the employer, was the Mexican government. We still, to this day, do not know how many billions of dollars are sent back in remittances, somewhere between 20 and 40 billion, to a very naturally rich country. And there was a height of cynicism that Mexico, for example, when they publish a comic book instructing people how to get across the border illegally, they assume two things. One, that they can flaunt U.S. law, and two, that their own people can't read, and therefore they need pictorial help. The second thing was that Mexico was opening these consuls all during the 90s. I think it's up to over 40 now. Again, this cynical idea that it's people, once they leave Mexico, suddenly become treasured citizens that need the help of the Mexican government, that heretofore will not provide education, housing, or medical care, but does welcome $40 billion, the second largest earner of foreign exchange. And this is quite Orwellian when you begin to look at it, because in communities in the Central Valley of California, when people are getting paid $10 and $12 an hour in cash, and they're sending up to half of that wage back to the Mexican government, the Mexican government expects the U.S. government to pick up the difference and almost forces it to by a campaign of moral persuasion. And yet the real amorality there is on the part of Mexico. They're really profiting off the backs of their own citizens who, as soon as they leave the border, become suddenly constituents that have real needs and need of government attention that they'll never find. And when you look at the number of Californians, for example, that are going down to Baja and buying second homes, you can see that Mexico, when in extremis, can have property rights, can encourage the rule of law to attract foreign investment. And it's very odd to see almost a highway from the interior going north of citizens that can't find housing that are Mexican nationals, and American citizens going to the right of them down Baja to buy second homes. So there's something very wrong here besides just the old standby excuse that Mexico is poor and we're wealthy. Third group, and most controversial, is what I would call the race industry. Most Mexican Americans, according to polls, deplore illegal immigration, but there is a constituency within that group, perhaps most concentrated in the media, university, and politics, that sees political advantages to having people represented by group interests, a group collective constituency that may or may not vote in a particular way. And so we have given, collectively, this country a pass to that group. So when we had, in the 90s, La Raza on our campuses, whose motto was a brown state for a brown people, or even the use of La Raza, the race, no other minority group that I can think of would be allowed to call themselves the race in polite discourse, and yet that was given a pass. So we know it was not only in the interest of the Mexican government, we know it was not only the interest of our employers, some of them at least, but it was also in the interest of a group of Americans who thought that they could make racial politics out of an open border. And finally, there was us in the middle class. When I grew up, everybody mowed their own lawn, if they had a pool, they kept them, they had somebody watching their children. But we in the middle class had adopted a lifestyle aristocracy. We were hiring people, even though that we knew they were illegal in the American Southwest, to tend to our needs with the excuse that this will free us up to be more competitive in the global market or to use our vast erudition and education for more noble pursuits, forgetting that we were part of this amoral process in itself, where we were using human capital, and then when the person aged and we no longer wanted them, we sent them out to the entitlement industry, then complained about it. As far as the prognosis, everybody has different views on guest workers. The word amnesty is almost undefinable now. It's been used so loosely. But I think the best thing that we could do is simply to shut the border. And we can do that through a tripartite plan of border fortification. I have no remorse in using that word. As a military historian, one of the great canards of military history is that walls don't work. They do. And if you were to build 800 miles in the easiest points of transit, that would discourage a lot of people from coming, as would fines on the employer, as would a verifiable identification system, and more security at the border. And most importantly, a change in the American mentality. We tried to stop the war on drugs by saying it was a wrong, an immoral thing to buy drugs because you were promoting chaos in South America. What we need to do to the American people is to remind them that every time they hire somebody here illegally from Mexico, whatever the circumstances are, they perpetuate a system that is not good for the internal reform that's necessary in Mexico. It's not good for ourselves, and it's flaunting the sanctity of the law. No civilization can endure long without a sanctity of the law. So if we were to stop the borders, that pool of 11 to 18 million people would be relatively static, and then the formidable powers of popular assimilation, popular culture could start to work. We could insist on English and assimilation, and we would have some type of grip on it. And then all of the other issues, I think, could be subsidiary, and we could adjudicate those. But if we don't stop the border, I think we're going to be looking at a situation that we all abhor everywhere from Rwanda to Iraq to the Balkans. The idea of multiculturalism rather than multiracialism under a unique culture is a bankrupt concept, both historically and in contemporary terms. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm ethically sourced Andrew Heaton, and you are sustainably watching Mostly Weekly. Put down the Tide Pod. Congratulations! We survived the government shutdown. This is our 19th shutdown since 1976. When we get 20, we get a free coffee. But brace yourself for another government shutdown. And another, and another, and another. Congress avoided a shutdown this time due to the revolutionary technology of, and I'm not making this up, a talking stick. Apparently, Congress couldn't talk about immigration policy without a talking stick to determine who can talk, which is juvenile. And I think we can all agree that excuse me, I have the talking stick, Sarah. Please, would you please? Thank you. Thank you. Congress stopped the shutdown this time by passing what's called a continuing resolution, which just means that government funding continues as is until Congress actually passes a budget. Continuing resolutions work, but not well. They don't account for reallocating funding if the value of programs has shifted or if they can be retired. And sadly, the last time we went an entire year without resorting to a CR was 1997. We've been running on continuing resolutions since October, and presumably we'll be running on them up until the Winfrey administration takes over. Now, it's true that many libertarians view the federal government as one big human resources department with guns. And I can understand why you might think a shutdown would be a cause for libertarians to celebrate. But you'd be wrong. Yes, the government is bloated and inefficient, and we should amputate several of its appendages. But a government shutdown doesn't actually accomplish anything. It doesn't shrink the size of federal agencies. It doesn't save money. It's even counterproductive to limited government in the long term. Let me explain. No shrinkage. As soon as the federal government reboots, all the government agencies, drug wars, and bureaucrats are still there. In fact, a lot of them never left. Here are just some of the government functions unaffected by shutdowns. Expense. Nor do we save any money during a government shutdown. Social Security, entitlements, and defense spending don't get their funding cut or reformed. Plus, like something out of the Twilight Zone, government shutdowns actually cost America more than if the government had just stayed active. Portrait of a country where government costs more to shut down than to actually run, where non-essential employees get paid in the future for past inactivity. A country within the Twilight Zone. And shutdowns are expensive. According to Standard & Poor's, the U.S. economy lost $24 billion during the 2 weeks of the 2013 government shutdown. That's $1.5 billion per day. How? Shutdowns cause mass inefficiencies that take a heavy economic toll on the private sector. The shutdown delays business transactions requiring federal permits, it postpones court cases, and it restricts travel by withholding passports. Plus, museums and parks can't collect fees, which takes revenue from the agencies and hurts tourism. In 2013, about 40% of non-military federal employees were considered non-essential, and they were furloughed, which is to say temporarily laid off. But as soon as these forlorn, furloughed federal employees come back, they get back paid. In other words, a government shutdown is basically a mandated, paid vacation for federal employees. So the government winds up spending the same amount that it would have if it stayed open, but without providing the services our tax dollars are paying for. That means veterans may not get their checks, unemployment benefits stop, tax rebates cease, and vacations to our finest national monuments get scuttled. Backlash. A government shutdown may even hurt the cause of small government in the long run. When societies lose faith in their institutions, they tend to embrace authoritarianism. When the government doesn't work, people tend to respond by seeking, you guessed it, more government. It's like trying to drink yourself sober or dealing with playground bullies by giving one of the bullies a chainsaw. It would be great if we shrunk the government, but the government we have should be lean and efficient, helpful and simple. Sort of like a talking stick. The way towards limited government is through debate and legislation and giving people and markets time to adjust. Shutdowns are the opposite of that. They're a combination of partisanship, squabbling, and incompetency, #partisquapetency. The only way past perpetual shutdowns is if our elected leaders act like civil adults trying to solve a common problem. Bipartisanship.
Here in South Africa, there are a few facts that we all sort of know, but nowhere has it been documented with references and it being made into an academic document. That has changed with this book that was written by my friend called Kill the Boer, and then underneath it says Government Complicity in South Africa's Brutal Farm Murders. Now, before I talk about the facts inside the book, there are just a few things that I need to point out. Some people are accusing Arends of doing this for the money, of trampling on other people's graves to make a quick buck out of it. And for that reason, I'm going to tell you now that even though Arends has worked on this book for 3 years, he's not going to take any royalties out of it. Also, for the same reason, I'm not going to provide any affiliate links to this book in the description. If you decide to buy it after watching this video, you can just Google Kill the Boer book and you'll find the appropriate links. I'm going to start with the thing that really touched me the deepest. And that is two things that has been pointed out inside this book. The first one is a gang leader from Cape Town who was in jail for farm murders, who has confessed that he got his orders to kill the farmers from Julius Malema himself. The other one is an ANC member who also killed people, who then later confessed to Arends Roots and AfriForum that he killed them because he got the orders directly from Luthuli House, which is the ANC's headquarters. Now, these are very, very, very serious allegations, but what really solidifies the argument of the government's complicity in farm murders for me is the fact that none of these has been investigated. Both were thrown under the rug. I was talking to Arends Roots about this specific point in an interview at the Kill the Boer book launch.
Yes, so there was an audio clip that was played on Carte Blanche, the current affairs show, more than a year ago, where a general of the 28 prison gang said, he was recorded having said that Julius Malema came to speak to them in prison, and he spoke to them about farm murders, and he asked them when he comes out, if they need weapons to kill farmers, they can come to him. And that was recorded and it was aired on Carte Blanche, and there's been no investigation into that. It's an extremely serious allegation, and it hasn't even been investigated. And then also, I spoke during the course of writing this book, I was contacted by someone from prison who said to me he needs to speak to me urgently, he has information that he wants to share with me. I went to see him, he said to me that he has committed a farm murder, and he said that he was a member of Mkonto Isizwe, which is of course the military wing of the ANC, and he said that the ANC told him to murder that farmer, and when he did so and when he was caught, they pretended like they didn't know who he was.
While we were at the book launch, an interesting development was that the current leader of the third biggest party in South Africa, the EFF, Julius Malema, tweeted out that he was maybe behind farm murders. Something that Arends also said during the interview that pointed to government complicity was:
the book is about how and why the South African government should be regarded as complicit, and there are a variety of reasons for that. As a matter of fact, there are 10 different reasons which I highlight in the book. One of them is, for example, the fact that in 2007, according to government statistics, there was a 25% increase in farm attacks, and the government's response to this is, we're not going to release any more statistics about this. Other than that, we find that there's repeated incidents of hate speech towards white farmers by even the state president, negative stereotyping of farmers, and in the book I also tell some stories of cases of incidents where the ANC seem to have been involved with the attacks to some extent, and where members of the police seem to have been involved.
One of the most touching stories in this book was the story of Mirihandra Yenis, where she told about her husband that was murdered in front of her and her children. Emotions were running high at the book launch event while she was telling the story to us.
We struggled, I pulled back. At that stage, my daughter, who was 6, put up her little hand and she said, "I've got money. You can take my money. I've got a piggy bank." And I just wanted the floor to swallow her. I showed her, don't say anything. I didn't want them to turn around. I didn't want them to see her or look at her. As they turned around towards her, my husband got up for the very last time. He gave 2 steps forward and he said, "Please." It sounded like he was crying, which he was. And then the one guy said, "Oh, just kill him, brother. Just kill him." The shot rang out and it hit him between the eyes, right in front of us. She said to me the other night, "Mommy, they killed me too that night." And I said to her, "No, she's 8 years old now." I said to her, "You're not dead. We're still here. I need to show them that life can still be good, even though they've seen the worst. I said to her, you're still alive. We're still here. She said, no, they killed me too.
While we were sitting there and the emotions were running high, we just heard about another farm murder that just happened in Hartbeespoort. What sets these farm murders apart from all the other murders in the country is the absolute brutality. I'm going to read you a few stories from the book about the torture and brutality of these murders. The first story is of Trevor Rees. He was tortured with pliers, electric pliers, and then bleach were forced down his throat to kill him. The second was Nikki Simpson. She was tortured with an electric drill. They drilled holes into her feet, her legs, and her hands. The third one I want to talk about is Gwen Cooks. She was stripped naked and asked if she wanted to be raped or shot. She said she would rather be shot. Then she was tortured with cooking oil and melted plastic. This is the exact same kind of torture that was used in ANC terrorist death camps before the takeover in 1994. But I'll talk about that later. Since this book was finished writing, there have been 34 farm murders this year alone. At the event, they read the names and the ages of all of those people out. And what really touched me was the fact that most of them were over 70 years old. These attackers are preying on the elderly and sometimes the children and women. One of the most significant things that Ernst Roots points out in this book is the method of torture that was used in the ANC death camps abroad in the past regime are the exact same methods sometimes used in farm attacks. I don't really want to go into detail on these methods, but I'll quickly read some of them to you. The dripping of melted plastic and warm cooking oil onto the victims, like we just saw what happened to one of the victims. The whipping with electric cables on the soles of feet is another method that is widely used in farm attacks. Another method is called ukumpompa. It's where the cheeks of the victim are inflated and then they are slapped through the face with a shoe to pop their eardrums. These are just a few examples of the torture method learned in ANC death camps that are also used in farm attacks today. Talking too much about the numbers won't do justice to the mood of this video, but in the book the numbers are very clearly stated. I have made a video about the exact numbers of the killings as well as how the media report on them. A video link will be in the description. But just one thing that I want to point out in this video is that black on white killings are 5,750% higher than white on black killings. Yet, the media are 11 times more likely to report on a white on black incident than they are to report on a black on white incident. If you want to know more about the numbers, you can also buy the book or go watch the video that I made about them. The last point that I want to get to is one that I have personal experience with. Many people in the media claim that these attacks are not racial, or in most cases not racial. To debunk that myth, I have a personal story to tell. This story isn't in the book because it happened many years ago when I was still a high school boy. My great uncle and aunt were tortured to death, and in the blood the attacker wrote 666 white devils on the walls of the house after he tortured them to death. Yet, the attack was not classified as a racial farm attack. Another event that was talked about in the book is one where the attackers in the farm attack yelled, "Die, die, white men, viva Julius Malema," while they were torturing the farmer to death. Yet, in the official statistics, this was also not a racial attack, or an attack with a racial motive. It's very easy to prove that the official statistics are skewed to hide the racial components of these attacks. Before I get to the bonus content, I just want you If you enjoy the content that I produce on this channel, subscribe to my channel, and also remember to like this video and comment and share it with all of your friends. It is especially important that you comment so that the ratings of this video can go up and more people can hear these stories. Let's take a look at the interview that I had after the launch of the book with Steve Hofmeyer.
I'm standing here with Steve Hofmeyer, very famous Afrikaans singer and activist for Afrikaner and Boer rights. How are you, Steve?
Fantastic, Willem, thank you very much.
We were just here at the Kill the Boer book launch, and Steve, what were your thoughts sitting in there?
Yeah, they usually give you an opportunity to ask questions, but I've learned to put a guard in front of my mouth when I'm embittered, when I'm angry, when I'm frustrated. So I shut up. I sat there and listened to it. 10 years ago, when I started mentioning the disproportionate murders, it was taboo. I became the most boycotted white man in Africa for being a racist. 10 years later, there's a book about it. I'm telling you now, there's a white genocide. It will be tabooed from here onwards. I will be boycotted. 10 years from now, there will be a book to prove that. I'm just afraid, as they know, my famous quote is, the problem with the definition of genocide is that it's something that has already happened, and that is too late for me. So I'm sorry it's happening to my people. I'm sorry that my silences is letting a few of those murders through. We're working with the most conservative stats, which means we are overlooking some people who are dying tonight. And yeah, my heart is broken for my people. I wish I could fix my people, because then I can fix South Africa, and I'd like to be part of that process when it starts one day.
Well, we thank you for that, and as I said on Twitter, you were always my favorite racist.
Thank you guys for watching, and please remember to share this with as many people as you can so that these stories can get out there and the silence around farm murders can be put to sleep once and for all.